In mid-December 1944, the Western Front, once believed to be stabilizing after the liberation of France, erupted into chaos. Deep within the dense forests of the Ardennes, the German High Command launched a massive, unexpected counteroffensive designed to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle fought by the United States in World War II. As German panzers surged through thinly held American lines, confusion swept across Allied headquarters. Reports were fragmented, units were scattered, and for a moment, the Germans achieved complete surprise. Among the towns caught in the onslaught was Bastogne, a small but strategically crucial crossroads in Belgium. Its road network fed the entire region, and whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of armies. By December 19th, the situation had reached a breaking point. The German XLVV Panzer Corps encircled the town, trapping the famed 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division. Ammunition was low, medical supplies were scarce, and the brutal winter, with temperatures dipping far below freezing, threatened to kill as many soldiers as enemy fire. As the noose tightened, General Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. Present were the most senior Allied commanders, including General Omar Bradley and General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army. What happened at that meeting became one of the defining moments of Patton's military career. When Eisenhower asked how long it would take Patton to disengage, pivot north, and strike the German flank to relieve Bastogne, most officers expected a cautious estimate, perhaps a week or more. Instead, Patton stunned the room. He confidently declared that he could attack with 3 divisions in just 48 hours. Eisenhower, skeptical but impressed, pressed him on how such a rapid movement could be possible. Patton simply replied, "My staff has already prepared the necessary plans." What no one at the table yet understood was that Brigadier General Halley Maddox, operations chief of the Third Army, had anticipated the possibility of a German offensive for weeks. Under Patton's direction, the Third Army staff had secretly drafted 3 separate contingency plans, labeled simply as North, East, and West. One of these plans, Operation North, outlined the exact maneuver Eisenhower now asked for. Maddox and his planners had already run the numbers, the routes, the fuel requirements, the timing, the staging areas, and the order in which divisions would disengage. This was not improvisation, it was preparation. Still, even with these plans, the challenge was colossal. Patton's army was spread across a broad front, heavily engaged in offensive operations toward the Saar. To wheel an entire army 90 degrees while fighting, to move approximately 100,000 soldiers and over 130,000 vehicles in midwinter, on icy roads, under the threat of German air and artillery attack. That was an undertaking without precedent in modern warfare. But Patton had absolute confidence in his staff, his officers, and his men. When the Verdun Conference ended, Patton immediately put his army in motion. Orders were radioed and couriered across hundreds of miles of front. Units were told to disengage from combat at once. Artillery batteries limbered their guns and rolled out. Tanks, half-tracks, ambulances, bulldozers, fuel trucks, and command vehicles began the long night march north. Discipline was strict and timing was everything. Bridges were reinforced to handle the weight of armored columns. road intersections were controlled, like clockwork, by military police. Any delay could have doomed the operation. As night fell across the frozen Ardennes, engines roared to life. Convoys stretched for miles. Headlights blacked out as they pushed through sleet, snow, and exhaustion. Troops marched beside shivering Sherman tanks. Supply officers frantically calculated fuel consumption, knowing that even a slight miscalculation could stop an entire division. Yet, the columns kept moving, against impossible conditions. The Third Army pivot had begun, that would soon become one of the most extraordinary achievements of World War II. As the orders from the Verdun Conference rippled across the front, the men of Patton's Third Army found themselves thrust into one of the most remarkable forced marches in military history. It was the night of December 19th, 1944, and winter had sunk its claws deep into Europe. Snow blanketed the countryside, turning roads into slick sheets of ice. Winds whipped across open fields, cutting through greatcoats and numbing fingers within minutes. Under these brutal conditions, the Third Army began its astonishing 90-degree pivot toward Bastogne, a maneuver so complex that many commanders doubted whether it was even physically possible. But Patton had promised he would attack in 48 hours, and every man understood what was at stake. To appreciate the magnitude of the operation, one must understand the scale of the Third Army. This was not a small task force. It was a massive mechanized army group composed of armored divisions, infantry divisions, artillery battalions, engineering brigades, service troops, and logistical units stretching across a front nearly 100 miles wide. Nearly 100,000 soldiers and over 130,000 vehicles had to be withdrawn from active combat, refitted, reoriented, and thrust northward at maximum speed. The fact that this was achieved remains one of the greatest logistical feats of the Second World War. At the center of this whirlwind of activity was Brigadier General Halley Maddox and the Third Army staff. Maddox's team, veterans of Patton's relentless operational tempo, had spent the previous week constructing contingency plans in secret. Their strategy for the northern shift was not simply a list of routes and timings. It was a masterpiece of synchronized movement. The plan staggered departure times for each division, allocated priority routes, designated refueling zones, and ensured that supply columns would never bottleneck behind frontline combat units. Every bridge on the route was surveyed for weight limits. Every intersection was assigned military police teams. Even the order of march for individual companies was predetermined. But planning alone could not overcome the sheer brutality of the winter weather. Snow continued to fall in thick curtains, obscuring visibility. Trucks skidded on icy inclines. Tank treads froze and locked. Engines that had run flawlessly in summer now sputtered in the cold, requiring constant attention from exhausted mechanics. Fuel was a perpetual concern. The freezing temperatures thickened gasoline and diesel, making engines harder to start. If a tank or heavy vehicle ran out of fuel, it risked becoming an immovable roadblock for the entire column behind it. Yet the Third Army had developed a reputation for solving impossible problems. Engineers worked around the clock, spreading sand and salt across critical junctions. Maintenance crews leaped onto stalled vehicles, restarting engines with blowtorches and brute force. Mess sergeants cooked hot meals along the roadside to keep men from collapsing from cold and exhaustion. Despite everything, the columns kept grinding north, mile after mile. For the soldiers, the march was both physically punishing and emotionally intense. Many had been fighting for days without rest. Now they were asked to march or ride through the night, sleeping in frozen fields or inside freezing half-tracks while artillery thundered in the distance. The snow absorbed sound, creating an eerie quiet, broken only by the rumble of tank engines and the crunch of boots on ice. Yet morale remained high. Word spread quickly that the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was surrounded at Bastogne. Many soldiers of the Third Army had fought alongside the 101st in earlier campaigns. They knew the caliber of those paratroopers. They also knew that if anyone deserved help, it was them. Behind the combat units came the unsung heroes of the operation, the logisticians. Massive supply trains carried artillery shells, fuel, rations, medical supplies, winter clothing, radio equipment, and spare parts. Artillery battalions were particularly dependent on fuel and ammunition, and Patton insisted that they be ready to fire the moment they reached the new front. Service units leapfrogged forward, establishing temporary depots along the route. Army engineers reinforced bridges weakened by the winter freeze, allowing Sherman tanks and M7 Priest self-propelled guns to pass safely. Military police controlled traffic, ensuring that no column became gridlocked. Throughout the march, Patton himself drove relentlessly along the roads, his jeep skidding on ice as he inspected progress. He barked orders, encouraged weary troops, and radiated his unshakable confidence. His presence alone seemed to stiffen the spine of every soldier he encountered. He reminded them that history was watching, that the world would remember whether they reached Bastogne in time. By December 21st, after 2 days of ceaseless movement, the first elements of the Third Army reached their staging areas south of Bastogne. Exhausted, frozen, and battered by the weather, they nonetheless prepared to attack immediately. Against all odds, Patton had made good on his promise. The relief of Bastogne was no longer a distant hope. It was now a matter of hours. As the Third Army completed its astonishing pivot north, the task of breaking through to the encircled defenders of Bastogne fell primarily to the men of the 4th Armored Division, led by the aggressive and razor-sharp General John S. Tiger Jack Wood, who had recently been relieved, but whose fighting spirit lived on within the ranks. The division was now under the command of Major General Hugh Gaffey. Within this powerful armored formation, one combat team would soon enter the pages of military legend. Combat Command R, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton W. Abrams. At the helm of his Sherman tank, famously named Cobra King, Abrams would spearhead the final thrust to reach the trapped 101st Airborne Division. But before the path to glory came a gauntlet of brutal fighting. The Germans had not spent the previous days idle. The Ardennes offensive had granted them initial momentum, and they were determined to hold on to it. To block Patton's northward advance, German forces hurriedly established defensive belts consisting of dug-in infantry from the Volksgrenadier divisions, seasoned paratroopers of the Fallschirmjäger, and elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. Supporting them were anti-tank guns, Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, and a handful of panzers tasked with striking at exposed American columns. The terrain itself favored the defenders. Dense woods, narrow roads, and steep ridges forced the Americans to fight through natural choke points, easily targeted by German artillery. From the moment the 4th Armored Division entered the fight, the battle became a slugging match against both the enemy and the elements. Snow lay deep atop the Ardennes ridgelines, while ice coated every road and track. Visibility was often reduced to a few hundred yards. Sherman tanks and half-tracks labored up frozen slopes, their engines groaning under the strain. Infantrymen advanced cautiously, rifles at the ready, every breath forming white plumes in the cold air. German machine guns cracked from hidden positions, while mortar rounds exploded in bursts of snow and shrapnel. The road to Bastogne was short on the map, but agonizingly long in reality. Abrams Combat Command R, known for its aggressiveness and mobility, led the charge through the Belgian villages dotting the approach routes. Places like Bigenville, Martelong, Chaumont, and Clochemont. These once quiet towns had become fortified strongpoints. The Germans defended every crossroads, every farmhouse, every bend in the road. House-to-house fighting erupted as American infantry cleared buildings, flushing out snipers and machine gun nests. Tanks fired point-blank into stone walls, blasting holes for infantry to advance through. Engineers rushed forward under fire to clear mines from narrow pathways. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. Despite the resistance, Abrams pushed forward relentlessly. He was a commander known for leading from the front, and Cobra King was never far from the action. The tank's crew, skillful, battle-tested men, maneuvered through enemy fire, often emerging at impossible angles to deliver a decisive blow. Abrams' voice crackled across the radio net with constant orders, corrections, and encouragement. He had a reputation for remaining calm even in the most chaotic battles, and that steadiness inspired the men around him. As the days wore on, the German defenders grew increasingly desperate. They were running low on fuel, ammunition, and manpower. Their supply lines were stretched thin, hammered continuously by Allied fighter bombers whenever the winter skies briefly cleared. Still, they fought with determination, knowing that if Bastogne were relieved, the momentum of the Ardennes offensive would collapse. Every hour that the 101st Airborne held out without supplies was an hour the Germans hoped would break American resolve. Yet the men in Bastogne had no intention of cracking. Their stubborn defense, epitomized by General Anthony McAuliffe's famous "nuts" reply to the German surrender demand, fueled the Third Army's determination. The men of the 4th Armored Division were not simply fighting a battle. They were fighting to save comrades who were cold, hungry, surrounded, and outnumbered. By Christmas Day, 1944, the fighting reached a fever pitch. The Americans had closed to within just a few miles of the town. German paratroopers mounted furious counterattacks, attempting to slow the approach long enough for armored units to regroup. But the pressure from Patton's entire corps was now too much. The German line began to buckle. On the afternoon of December 26th, at approximately 1650 hours, Cobra King surged forward through the village of Assinoy. As the Sherman tank crested a rise, its crew saw figures ahead. American paratroopers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The siege had been broken. Cheers erupted. The road to Bastogne was officially open. Abrams' combat team radioed the message that would echo across history. "We're here." It marked not only the relief of Bastogne, but the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. Patton's daring gamble had succeeded. While Patton's Third Army clawed its way north through snow, ice, and fierce German resistance, the men trapped inside Bastogne were fighting a desperate battle of survival. Vision and the attached elements of the 10th Armored Division, the encirclement was not merely a tactical challenge. It was a test of endurance, courage, and unbreakable resolve. Isolated, freezing, and short on supplies, these soldiers became the central figures in one of World War II's most iconic defenses. Bastogne's significance lay in its network of 7 major roads, radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. This crossroads town controlled the movement of armies across the Ardennes region, making it a prime target for the German offensive. When the enemy launched their surprise attack on December 16th, the 101st Airborne, resting after heavy fighting in Holland, was rapidly trucked into the area to plug the gaps. They arrived just in time. Within days, German forces sealed the ring around Bastogne, cutting off all ground communication with the outside world. The winter conditions were among the harshest of the war. Snowstorms swept through the region, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and many paratroopers lacked proper winter clothing. Some men wrapped burlap or blankets around their boots in a desperate attempt to keep frostbite at bay. Food rations dwindled, ammunition was scarce, and medical supplies were nearly non-existent. Wounded soldiers shivered in makeshift aid stations, tended by overworked medics who often had to operate without anesthetics. Despite these hardships, morale remained remarkably resilient. The men of the 101st were elite soldiers, battle-tested, self-reliant, and fiercely loyal to one another. They fortified defensive positions in the surrounding woods and villages, digging foxholes into the frozen ground with numb hands. Machine gun nests were camouflaged beneath snow. Anti-tank squads waited silently at crossroads, listening for the distant rumble of German engines. Every man understood that Bastogne must hold. If the Germans broke through, the entire southern flank of the Allied line would collapse. Commanding the defense was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander, who had assumed temporary command after Major General Maxwell Taylor was absent. McAuliffe was calm, steady, and deeply respected by his troops. His leadership would soon become legendary. On December 22nd, after days of fierce fighting, a German delegation approached American lines under a white flag. They delivered a typed ultimatum demanding the honorable surrender of Bastogne. Failure to comply, they warned, would result in total destruction of the town and its defenders. McAuliffe's response, delivered with wry humor, captured the indomitable spirit of the airborne. Nuts! When his staff clarified this response for the Germans, they translated it simply as, "Go to hell." That single word, nuts, became a rallying cry. It reminded the men that surrender was not an option. The 101st Airborne intended to hold Bastogne, no matter how bleak the situation appeared. The German attacks intensified. Panzer units clawed at the perimeter, launching repeated assaults on key villages such as Neuville, Foy, and Marvy. Paratroopers fought from tree lines and ditches, repelling wave after wave of infantry, supported by artillery barrages that shook the ground. Buildings collapsed, trees splintered like matchsticks. Snow-filled foxholes offered little protection from shells that burst overhead, showering fragments of steel and ice upon the defenders. Yet even as the ring tightened, the Americans held firm. The division's artillery, though short on shells, proved devastatingly effective. Each round had to count, and McAuliffe's gunners made sure it did. When weather permitted, the U.S. Army Air Force's eyes from the sky, food, ammunition, and medical kits drifting down beneath colored parachutes. These precious lifelines kept the division alive. Still, every man inside Bastogne knew that their survival depended on relief from outside. The thud of distant artillery and the faint glow of fires on the horizon suggested that a major battle was unfolding beyond the German lines. Rumors spread that Patton was on the move. Some believed he would arrive in days. Others doubted anyone could break through in time. But the airborne kept fighting. They patched holes in the lines, counterattacked when necessary, and refused to let the Germans gain a foothold. The siege dragged on for 8 agonizing days. And then, on December 26th, as twilight settled over the frozen battlefield, tank engines echoed from the south. Soldiers in the perimeter positions strained their eyes. When the silhouette of a Sherman peered in the distance, Cobra King leading the way, a wave of relief and triumph swept across the defensive line. The cheers that erupted in the snow-choked woods signaled that the impossible had happened. Bastogne had been relieved. When the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to the encircled defenders of Bastogne at 1650 hours on December 26, 1944, the moment instantly became one of the most celebrated achievements of World War II. But the relief of Bastogne was not the end of the story. Far from it. The following days would witness fierce fighting, strategic realignment, and a profound shift in the momentum of the Battle of the Bulge. More importantly, the operation cemented General George S. Patton's reputation as one of history's most dynamic commanders, demonstrating the decisive impact that speed, preparation, and audacity can have in war. The immediate aftermath of the breakthrough saw soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division and the 4th Armored Division exchanging exhausted but triumphant greetings. Many of the paratroopers, gaunt from hunger and sleeplessness, stumbled forward to shake hands with the tank crews. Others simply sat down in the snow, overwhelmed by relief. The men of the Third Army had expected a joyous reunion, and they received it. But they also found a division still very much under fire. Bastogne was relieved, but it was not yet secure. German forces continued to launch attacks in an effort to re-establish the encirclement and prevent the Americans from consolidating their positions. Over the next several days, heavy fighting erupted around the villages south and east of Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division, reinforced by elements of the 9th Armored and 26th Infantry Divisions, battled to widen the corridor and eliminate German footholds. Snowstorms returned, blanketing the battlefield in white and reducing visibility once again. Artillery echoed across the ridgelines, and the violent crackle of small arms fire rolled through the forests like breaking branches. Although the Germans fought tenaciously, their offensive had lost its momentum. They had been denied their key objective, and the arrival of fresh American divisions further eroded their position. Strategically, the relief of Bastogne had enormous implications. The German Ardennes offensive hinged on rapid movement. Without Bastogne, their armored spearheads could not secure the road network needed to push west toward the Meuse River. With the crossroads firmly in American hands, the German timetable collapsed. Fuel shortages worsened, mechanical failures increased, and the winter skies, slowly beginning to clear, allowed Allied air power to return in force. Fighter bombers and heavy bombers struck German convoys, supply points, and assembly areas. Tanks that had once thundered forward now sat immobilized, starved of fuel, and relentlessly targeted from above. By early January 1945, the German advance had stalled completely. Patton's forces, joined by troops from the 1st and 9th Armies, counterattacked across the southern flank of the Bulge. Bastogne became the pivot point for the Allied response. The encircled town that had once appeared doomed now served as a fortress anchoring the American counteroffensive. From this stronghold, the Allies steadily squeezed the Bulge, until the front was restored to its pre-December lines. For Patton, the successful relief of Bastogne validated his bold leadership philosophy. Throughout his military career, he preached the importance of mobility, offensive action, and meticulous preparation. The Bastogne operation exemplified all three. It showcased his ability to seize opportunity, adapt to changing circumstances, and push his army to its absolute limits. Critics had often accused Patton of recklessness, but Bastogne proved that his audacity was grounded in rigorous planning. The contingency plans developed by Brigadier General Halley Maddox and the 3rd Army Staff were crucial to the operation's success. Without their foresight, the celebrated 48-hour pivot would have been impossible. The soldiers who carried out the relief, tankers, infantrymen, engineers, medics, logisticians, and countless support personnel, also etched their names into history. Their march through the snow, their battles in the frozen villages, and their determination to break through the German lines form one of the most inspiring chapters of the American experience in World War II. Many would later speak of Bastogne as the moment when they truly felt part of something larger than themselves. The relief was not just a victory, testament to what can be achieved when preparation, leadership, and unshakable will converge. In the decades since the battle, Bastogne has become synonymous with American resilience. Visitors to the site see monuments honoring both the defenders and the relief forces. Veterans of the 101st Airborne and the 4th Armored Division have gathered there to share memories, honor fallen comrades, and reflect on the events that shaped their lives. The story of Bastogne continues to be studied in military academies worldwide as an example of crisis leadership and operational genius. Above all, the relief of Bastogne endures as a powerful reminder. Even in the darkest hours of war, courage and determination can turn the tide. Against the fiercest winter, overwhelming odds, and the full weight of the German Ardennes offensive, the American soldier held firm and prevailed.